Hello everyone, it's Dr. J here. In this video, we will look at how to dynamically connect to a Microsoft database in Delphi. In a previous video that I did, we connected to a Microsoft database in Delphi, and we made use of components, the ADIO connection component. We made use of a ADIO table and a data source component. These components were placed in a data module, and each of these components were configured as it is outlined in this table. And once they are configured, then they can be used on the main form, and you can then link these components to your grid and view your information from your table. In this video, the focus is going to be on how to dynamically create these components. So we are not going to physically add them onto our data module. However, we will create these components making use of Delphi code. Well, to achieve this, the first step, we are going to start a new Delphi application. I will call this my main form. This particular unit will be my main form _u. Step 2, we are going to create an empty data module, and that will be my dm _u. And the third step would be to create a new unit. In this unit, we're going to create a class, and this class will contain code to dynamically create those 3 database components that we need. So let's look at these 3 steps in greater detail. Well, in the first step, we're going to start a new Delphi application. That's fairly straightforward. On the main form, I'm going to add a data grid. So here is my data grid. And I'm going to have a button, and I'm going to code this button. So when I click on this button, it will display the information from my table into this grid. So that's my first step, creating a new Delphi application. Step 2, we are now going to create a new data module. If you are not sure how to create a data module, refer back to my previous video where I demonstrate how this process takes place. On the data module, we would usually place our 3 components, but in this instance, the data module is going to remain empty. I am going to change the name property. If you look at the name property, you will see that the name is set to DM for data module and DB. That's my database. So I've named this data module DMDB. Step 3, this is where we create a new unit. To do so, we would have clicked on File, New and Unit. This creates a blank unit, and you have to now start coding this unit from scratch. Within this unit, we're going to create a class, a new class. This is done in the type section of the unit. And we're going to create a type called TDB. And this particular class is going to have these 3 components being created dynamically. There is a procedure that will automatically set this up for us. So let's look at this particular class in more detail. So this is the unit. The unit name is db unit _u. And in the users section, these are the different references that I need to make use of in order to make use of databases and to utilize the components that I want to work with. In particular, you should take note of dm _u. This was the unit for my data module. I'm referencing this data module since you will see in the implementation, I need to make use of my data module. So after the user section, I create a type, and the type I'm creating is TDB. It's a class object. We usually need to put our private attributes and our public methods. Here, these attributes that I have, I'm keeping them all public. It just makes things easier when we are coding the application. I've got a constructor. The constructor has two parameters. The one is for the database name, and the second is for the table name. So these are, I bring them in as parameters, and when the object is being created, I send in the names of the name of the database and the table. And then we have a procedure called setup DB table, and this procedure is responsible for dynamically creating the components that we need to be created. This is the definition. Let's now jump into the implementation for the constructor and the procedure setup table. So in the implementation, you can see there's the constructor with the two parameters, and these two parameters are being assigned to the attributes. You will notice that the attribute is fdb name and ftable name. So those attributes take on the names of the values that I'm bringing in as my parameters. So when I create my object, I'll send in these two names, and they will automatically assign them to my attributes, which I've created above. Then if we now look at the setup table, the implementation for setup DB table, you will recall that we need, previously when we did this, we placed the component on the data module. We then built a connection string, and we set the login prompt property to false. This was all demonstrated in a previous video that I did. So these are the three changes that I'm going to be making for this particular ADIO connection. So to achieve that, the first thing that is done is we need to check that this attribute fdb name, remember that fdb name is the database name. Once the constructor is called, it's assigned to this attribute, and a check is being made to ensure that this database does exist. If it does exist, then we are now setting up our ADIO connection. So this is ADIO con. Again, that's the attribute here that is set up to ADIO connection. And this is equivalent to setting or placing this component onto our data module. DMDB is the data module. And since I'm making reference to the data module, that was the reason for adding the unit name for the data module to the user section. So if I go back, this is as good as placing the component onto the data module. And this is where I build the connection string. Notice that the database name is the attribute which is being brought into this, into the connection string. I will demonstrate how this can be done easily when I go into the Delphi end of things. But this is now the connection string that has been set up. And then the last property that needs to be set up is the login prompt needs to be set to false. So ADIO connection.login prompt is assigned the value false. So these three steps are equivalent to placing a database connection component onto the data module, and it's configuring the connection string and the login prompt property. Next, we need to configure the table. So this is the same 3 lines that I just explained. To configure the table, these were the 4 steps that we would have conducted previously. First, we need to place the table component onto the module. We need to set the connection property, select the table name, and set the active property to true. So here, the ADIO table is being created on the data module, dm.db, that's my data module. The ADIO con that was just configured earlier on is now set to the connection property for the table. Remember, ADIO table is an attribute. And then the table name is set to f table name. Keep in mind that f table name would have got its value when the constructor was called. We brought in the table name, and that was set to the attribute f table name. So the table name is then given its value, and finally we set the active property to true, which then allows me to have access to the data in this particular table. The third part is to set up the data, source. Now, in setting up the data source, again, we have to place the component onto the data module, and we have to then configure the data set property. So that would be here, I'm setting the data source attribute, where I'm saying data source is, and it's as good as me placing the data source component onto my data module. And then the data set property for the data source is being set to the ADIO table, which was just configured. Keep in mind that data source is my attribute. If I go back and look at my attributes, there it is. I've got my ADIO connection, ADIO table, and my data source. So that is the data source attribute that I've just configured. So this was step 3, where the class has now been set up. So let's go back onto the main form, and we now need to write code for this show table. When I click on the show table button, it needs to make use of the class that we just used in step 3 and pull in the data from the table onto our grid. So this is the code that we would need. This is the code that we would now need to make use for the show table button. So there's the code here for my button. But first, before we go into the code for the button, we need to create an object to our TDB class. That's the class that we created. So we need an object that belongs to the TDB class. And in order to use the TDB class, we have to add the reference, and the reference is db_unit_u. So that's the reference that makes use of this TDB class. Now that I've got an object, I can call up the procedures from that class through this object. So here I'm calling the constructor, the object gets created, and the constructor is automatically called. And the name of my database is dbmovies.mdb. And the table that I want to access is TBL actors. So these are the values that I'm sending into this class that I created. So the attributes for the database name and the table name will then be set. And then through my object, I then call the setup DB table, and the ADIO connection gets set up, the ADIO table gets set up, and finally the data source gets set up. And once the data source is set up, remember we made it a public variable. through the object, I can then access the data source, and I can set it to the data source for my grid. So this is essentially the steps that are required for me to achieve dynamically creating my components. Let's now look at how this code looks in Delphi. If I switch to my Delphi, and here you should take note on the right-hand side, there's my unit db unit underscore u, there's my DM, my data module, and there's my main form. So if I go onto the main form and I go to the design, this is the main form. We'll look at the code on the main form just now. If we look at the data module, I go to the design, you will see that the data module is empty. There are no components here. And then if you go to the class, this is the class that was created. These were the references. This is the reference to the data module. And there's the class that's been created. These are my attributes, and those are, I have my constructor and my procedure. And then if I look at the implementation, this is the constructor that we looked at. And this is the setup table. And with the setup table, we configured the three components, the audio connection, audio table, and the data source. You will remember for the actual connection string, a shortcut there would be go to the data module and then add an audio connection component to it. So, and double click it and build the connection string. Although we're not going to leave the component there, we just simply adding the component to build the connection string, and then we will delete the component from the data module. So that's the trick behind setting up the connection string to get the to build the connection string, and then you could copy that and paste it into this part of your program. You should also keep in mind that you would need to clean it up, since the connection string already would have the database name in it. So here you could then just split up the two strings and add your database name to that. So if I give this a run, just to see how this would work. Well, actually, before we give it a run, let's look at the code on the main form. This is the show table, and this is the object that I'm creating, objdb. This is the unit, db unit underscore u, db unit underscore u. That's my class. That's the name, the unit name for the class. And that contains the class type tdb. And through my object, I then am able to call my procedures. And once I've got the values and components set up, I can then use the data source, which will have the values, and I can link it to my grid, which is currently on my form. So let's give this a run. I give that a run, and when I click on Show Table, it then displays all the information that is on the table. I hope this video helps you to be able to dynamically create your components.